Dr. Hernandez Jarvis was born in Boston, Massachusetts. She grew up in Nayarit, Mexico. She's a proud bicultural, bilingual Mexican American and is currently the Vice President of Institutional Equity and Diversity at the University of Puget Sound. Prior to joining Puget Sound, she served for 4 years as the Associate Vice Principal of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Whitworth University. Dr. Hernandez is a cognitive psychologist with extensive publication records in the fields of biolinguistics, bilingualism, and the effects of acculturation on psychological well-being. She received her BA in psychology from the University of Akron and her master's and PhD in the psychology department at Hope College in Michigan for 24 years. While at Hope College, she served as the chair for the Department of Psychology and as the director of general education, as well as a leader in the faculty development program. She has facilitated workshops on intergroup dialogue and diversity education at institutions of higher learning across the nation, and has served on the faculty development committee of the Leadership Institute for Women in Psychology and the American Psychological Association. She has also served on several organizations, such as the Latin Americans United for Progress, and as a member of the Human Rights Commission in Spokane. She used to be a professional ballet dancer, and her favorite book from childhood was Peter Rabbit. Dr. Hernandez Jarvis's mornings are fueled by exercise before going to work, and the song giving her life is Limon y Sal by Julieta Venegas.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for that introduction. Really appreciate it. And can't tell you how exciting it is for me to be here this afternoon with all of you. It always fills my heart with joy, and I really mean that, to see so many young people developing their leadership skills and really working towards gaining access to higher education and advocating for that for others. That is just such an amazing work and so needed. So really, really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. And, you know, what I'm going to share is really my personal journey with all of you as a way of helping you think about the power of stories as we advocate for this higher education. So I hope that you can find a way to connect to that story, or at least to have that story help you and inspire you even more to do the work that you're doing. So one of the key takeaways from this summit, I hope, is to learn about the power of stories, the power of stories of access to education and why education matters. So I want to share with you my story of identity development. And your story may be very different, but I'm hoping that my story will inspire you to reflect on your own. So share my story of identity development and how education impacted my personal journey. How education made a huge difference in my life and allowed me to be now in the position to advocate for access to education for future generations as the Vice President for Institutional Equity and Diversity at a private institution. I want to start by stating what might seem obvious to many of you. I am a woman of color. Yo soy mujer de color. As I was preparing for this talk, I was reminded of an essay a friend of mine shared with me some years back. Her essay began with those words: I'm a woman of color. I'm using her prompt or her title to tell you about myself, the impact my identity has had in my educational and professional journey, the importance of embracing all of who you are and develop a sense of belonging even in places that were not created for people that look like me. I hope to encourage you to reflect on what gifts you bring to your community and about what it means to take space and assert that you belong in higher education. Yo soy una mujer de color. I'm a woman of color. I say that with confidence now, but as a child and an adolescent, I did not see myself as one and did not know what that meant for me. I was born, as Ryan mentioned, in Boston, Massachusetts, but grew up in Mexico. Growing up in Mexico, I was not aware of the importance or meaning of race, primarily because I wasn't the majority. All others around me looked like me. Most of us were brown. Many of us were mestizos or mixed race. Race and the race conversation did not seem central to my experience as a child. Don't get me wrong. Of course, racial identity does impact life in Mexico. And racism exists there as it does here and in other parts of the world. But racial identity was not important or relevant in my early childhood because, again, I was not being minoritized. But racial identity was not important. Well, the reality is that race was important and certainly colorism was, but I was not aware of it. My mother was a white American woman and my father was Mexican. Sadly, it didn't really take that long for me to have my first experience with prejudice and stereotypes, and slowly, experience after experience, taught me how race and ethnicity matter in our society. My first experience, at least when I can remember, was as a 6-year-old girl, pretty young. Here's the story. I was in first grade, living in Mexico, and at the end of the school day, kids had to line up by the door of the school until your parents came to get you, pick you up. I saw my mother walking towards the door of the school, and I said, oh, to the person at the door, I said, that's my mother, and pointed, to her. Some of the kids around me started laughing. And one kid said something like this, yeah, right, like that güera, which in Spanish, so you may know, means the white person. So this kid says, yeah, right, like that güera is your mom, as if. So I did not understand why they did not believe me or why it was difficult for them to see that she was my mom. I remember their faces when my mom called me and I started walking away with her holding my hand. The impact of that experience stayed with me, and it marked the beginning of my journey to understand racial identity, racism, and the impact of social identities in people's life experiences. I began to understand what white people held privilege not afforded to those that look like me. I slowly learned that I am a brown woman, a mixed race Mexican American. I learned what that meant to me and learned to value and love my racial identity. The pride I developed as a woman of color came from understanding my roots, in particular, my paternal roots, my Mexican family history, and the history of the Mexican people. I learned to love and be proud of La Raza de Bronce, the bronze race, in reference to, of course, our brown or bronze tone of our skin. I am Latina. Yo soy Latina. As a child of an American mother and a Mexican father, I had the privilege of moving between the US and Mexico at different points in my life. This meant that I shifted several times from being in the majority, as I was in Mexico, to being minoritized, and then back again. This shift led me to face what it meant to be minoritized, and in particular, what it meant to be Latinx. I never thought of myself as a person of color until I came to live in the US. And I learned that was a label and an identity given to me by those I interacted with, not something I had chosen. Here is a story to illustrate this. I attended a private college in Indiana for my first year in college. I received a full scholarship and I moved from Mexico City to rural Indiana. I was excited to be there, was proud of having received a merit scholarship. Imagine my cultural shock to move from one of the largest cities in the world to Richmond, Indiana, pretty rural at the time. During my second week on campus, I received an invitation to an event for Black students sponsored by the Black Student Union. I was surprised by the invitation. I was Latina. I could be considered an international student, perhaps. And these were identities that I claim. But why was I being invited to a Black student union or meeting? Not knowing how to respond to this invitation, I asked my advisor about it. I asked him to help me understand if this invitation was really for me or if there had been a mistake. I did not want to show up only to learn it was not a space I was welcomed. I did not want people to think I was claiming an identity that was not mine. My advisor explained that I had been invited because there were only a few Latinx students on campus, and the Black Student Union wanted to include us since there was no Latinx club. Their intention was to help me find community and a sense of belonging. I remember thinking that I appreciated the gesture, but I wondered whether I would feel I belong or that I would feel in community. I did go to the event and made some friends and engaged with that community. But the key point of that story is that that situation led me to think about what it meant to be Latinx in that context, and what it meant to be Latinx in America and in higher education. It also highlighted for me that it was a space in which there were not many people that looked like me. Eventually, I connected with other Latinx students. Honestly, I count them for you. One from Puerto Rico, one from Colombia, 2 Mexican Americans, one from Texas, one from California. It was a small college, given that, but a small group of people. For the rest of the campus, we were the Latino students. Never mind that we were actually quite different culturally, that even the Spanish that we spoke was different. Among ourselves, we were keenly aware that we were very different culturally. But to the rest of campus, we were all the same, and we were homogenized as Latinx. It was in this context, and among those who were racially minoritized and homogenized, that I developed my sense of what it meant for me to be Latinx, and furthermore, what it meant to be a Mexican American in the US. It was through questioning and reflecting and sharing that I learned that being Latinx was something I should define for myself and not let others define for me. For me, it meant a set of values, beliefs, shared experiences, and lenses that color my understanding of the world. Often expressed in Spanish, as English words seem at times insufficient and or imperfect. That experience also helped me understand what it meant to belong to a place, to a community, and how even though small in numbers, it was critical to be present rather than blend, to take space, participate, and make a difference, to transform the space so others will have an easier time in the future. At that time, little did I know that I was going to spend the rest of my life as a professional doing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work. So anyway, in childhood, I learned about race. In college, I developed a more complex understanding of my ethnicity, my Latinx identity, and what equity, inclusion, and belonging should look like. I began to explore and understand the social construction of race and ethnicity, to see and understand the difference between being ascribed a social identity and the expectations and stereotypes people held based on their perceptions of my identities, and my own definition and my social identity. I began to see myself as all of those concepts together in one. I also began to identify myself as a bicultural and bilingual, and see the importance and value of it. I was raised bilingual and bicultural. Our home was full of English and Spanish, smell of chiles and ketchup, tacos, tamales, and pozole, as well as burgers and French fries. That was all part of me. But to me, as a child, it was just life. I didn't think about the labels or what that meant. I never thought much of it. That was just how our family was. In college, I realized that was not a typical picture, and had to reconceptualize what it meant to me that I was bicultural, what it meant that I could speak English with my American extended family and friends, and speak Spanish with my Mexican relatives, mis primos, and Spanglish with my siblings and my parents. It meant that I could move from one environment to the next without a problem, and that I have learned to function effectively in 2 environments. But it also meant that I had to think about which values were mine, which traditions I believe in and why. And it meant at times to be not fully one or the other. I was not fully American, I was not fully Mexican, but I was Mexican American, Latinx, and a woman of color. So again, being bilingual was also a gift and a challenge. And I'm sure some of you in this summit have had that experience and shared that experience with me. Being truly bilingual in an academic setting was really tough. How many times my professors asked for clarification on a paper, and I explained what I was trying to say, and as I was doing it, realized that the idea was on target, but that I had not translated it into English in the right way. Or that when I put it in English words, some of the meaning of what I was trying to convey was lost or not clearly expressed. As a result, it always took me longer than my classmates to write my papers. Eventually, I was able to think, or to try to think always in English when doing academics, so that the writing will come easier. However, life always gives you surprises. I had a different experience when in graduate school. I was invited to give a research presentation at an international conference in Mexico. I was excited to be invited and offered to give not one, thinking, oh, this is great. Not just one talk, but two. I can do 2 talks. This is great. So a couple of weeks before the conference, I sat down to prepare the 2 30-minute presentations that I was actually going to give in Spanish in Mexico City. And let me tell you, panic hit big time. To my surprise, I had an incredible difficult time preparing those presentations in Spanish. It turns out that at that point, I had completed 2/3 of my undergraduate work and most of my graduate work all in English. So when it came to my profession as a psychologist, it was natural for me to think in English at that point. And now I had to translate that terminology and that language into Spanish. So it was quite challenging, even though Spanish was my mother tongue and my primary language. So what does that mean, or why this story is important to what we're talking about today is that I learned what it meant to be bilingual in an academic setting, which is very different than just being bilingual in a cultural setting. And that the importance of being bilingual as a component of my identity as a professional. When I was in high school in Mexico, I read books about psychology and decided what I was going to do, and my major was psychology. So I learned my major, or decided on my major, pretty early on. But in Mexico, some of you may know, after high school, you must actually select your profession and you go to a specialized school. So I had to go to the psychology school straight from high school. There is no such thing as liberal arts and no opportunity to explore different career paths before deciding on a major. So I had completed my first year of college in Indiana at a liberal arts school, then went back to Mexico to continue my schooling, and I had to start all over again and start with my first year in the School of Psychology. So by the time I finished my 3rd year in Mexico, I had done mostly psychology courses. But after that 2 years in Mexico, in the university in Mexico, I came back to the US. So I came going back and forth, came back to the US to finish my college education. At that point, I had taken 16 psychology courses, as well as math, statistics, and research methods. So when I came back to the US, it's like, oh, you've done all the things for your major. What you need to do now is do the general education. So I went back and started taking freshman classes and things like that. So again, another experience that made me feel, do I really belong here? How do I make sure that I understand what this experience means to me? Okay. So graduate school, again, was very challenging, not only because of the demands of the program, but because of a class of 25 graduate students that were accepted in the program I was in at Kent State University. I was one of 2 students of color. And there were only 2 professors of color in the program. Not many people looked like me or related to my experience. I often felt that I did not belong and felt like an imposter, and that at any moment people were going to realize I should not be there and would kick me out of the program. Pretty common for people like me to feel that way in college as well as in graduate school, especially when you don't see other models, which again gets me to why it's so important the work that you're doing to provide access and change that reality. I also felt not only that was my experience, but I also felt that the research questions as a graduate student that I was interested in were different than the mainstream. I was interested in questions that impacted Latinos, impacted my community. And that was not mainstream at the time to be studying. So another strike. And well, am I asking the right questions? Is my research really that important? Am I just not really prepared to ask the right questions? All of those were part of my development as a graduate student and professional psychologist. So I was researching how young kids, for example, develop language and how learning two languages or being bilingual impact the cognitive development of the child and the impact of the acculturation process on their well-being. Based on my life experiences, these were very important questions, practical questions that research that not too many people were investigating. These were topics that could make a difference for our people, of people like me from immigrants. I was fortunate enough to find two professors that mentored me. They thought the questions I asked were innovative and practical and supported me through 5 years of graduate work. However, what sustained me through those challenging years of graduate school was that I knew, and my Latinx community let me know, that what I was researching could potentially make a difference in their lives. They reminded me that the questions I was asking as a researcher may not be mainstream, but were critical to the experience of Latinx people and that it mattered to them. I won't lie, there were many struggles, but I eventually learned to be confident in my professional identity. And more than being confident, I learned how that professional identity as a psychologist meant to me and how it complemented and intersected with the other aspects of my social identity as a woman of color, a bicultural, and bilingual Latina. So lots of bits of my life story for you, but really understanding ourselves and the impact of our social identities in our lives and in our interactions with others can lead to better quality of life. All these identities have not just impacted and shaped a path in my personal and professional life. My social identities have been critical in the choices I have taken as a professional and as a psychologist. My identities and experiences linked to my identity again informed the research I did, the classes I taught as a professor, teaching multicultural psychology and the psychology of Latinx populations. They also influenced my decision to move into college administration, and in particular, into the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So moving into that area of college administration, how did I get there? That also has been challenging, okay? Although things have changed, certainly in the past probably 10 to 15 years, senior college administrative positions, vice presidents, presidents, provosts, deans, etc., are still predominantly occupied by white men. It was not an uncommon experience for me to be sitting in places where the majority of the administrators are men, or white men in particular, and where I might be the only person of color or the only woman of color. Often I had to insist to have my experience and the experiences of those that look like me to be present, to be considered, to be at the table. And that's my passion. And that's what this journey has taken me to be able to bring that voice in those settings, in those spaces where those spaces were not created for us. But I'm taking that space now and trying to make a difference for people like me. It is the development of my social identities that, as a woman of color, as a professional, as a psychologist, that give me the confidence to speak up for diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging in those places where decisions are being made for communities in higher education. It is those social identities that call me to engage others in building together a more equitable, fair, and socially just organization and more inclusive society. Okay. I want to share with you, I'm looking at the clock and making sure we give you some time for some questions. I'm going to cut down a little bit of what I have planned to share with you. But let me just share where I am now at the University of Puget Sound. I joined the University of Puget Sound because I saw it as a place that is leaning into challenging work of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and social justice. Many institutions try to avoid this work. Especially in the last 3 years, there's a lot of anti-DEI rhetoric in our nation. We need to even double or triple our efforts We live in a country, again, that believes in democracy and freedom, but it was founded on inequality, injustice, slavery, discrimination, and social hierarchical power structures. We love our country, but have a difficult time facing its troubled history and imperfections. If we want to do better, if we have aspirations for a better society, a better community, we need to recognize the imperfections of our past, the painful experiences of our people, and act to create a different us. Our social identities, when we enter into community, impact our relationships, our engagements with each other. The lenses and perspectives we use to learn in our classes, as well as in our extra and co-curricular activities, are critical. These social identities impact the choices we make. The diversity we bring to campus enriches our lives, but only if we are intentional about creating an environment of equity and inclusion. As you think about the social identities you bring to campus, you will all want to be part of the university community, engage and flourish. What can you do to be inclusive of those social identities that are different from yours? What can you do to help yourself and others develop a sense of belonging? Arthur Chan, who is a diversity, equity, and inclusion activist, says the following, which I really like and I've been using a lot at my university. Diversity is a fact, and we need to bring even more so of that diversity to our campuses. Now, equity is a choice. Inclusion is an action, and belonging is the outcome. So if the outcome we seek is belonging, what we need to do is to focus on equity and inclusion. Those are the key aspects, the process to get to that sense of belonging. Those two concepts are key to higher education access. So again, how can each of you advocate for equity and inclusion in higher education? Share your story of access. Share your story of how diversity, equity, and inclusion has positively impacted your educational journey. So as you leave today's summit, I encourage you to reflect on your responsibility to create wider access to higher education. How can you help? How can you make a choice to be equitable? That's your choice. And how can you help the institutions, the campuses that you're at, to be more equitable? What actions can you take to be more inclusive? What actions can you ask, not just ask, demand from your institutions to create more inclusive communities? How can you foster a strong sense of belonging for others in your campus? So let me stop there so I can entertain a few questions if there are any. I hope my story, I went very personal with this, but I hope my story is truly an inspiration for you, not because it's, amazing or anything, but because there's lots of people like me that want to have that access to education that can make a difference for their communities that sadly don't have the opportunity to do so. And now that we are there on our campuses, it's not just a nice thing to do, but it's our responsibility to advocate for access for all underrepresented populations to engage in higher education.
You talked about the importance of DEI and belonging work, and over the past 3 years, really, your profession, right? Your world is under attack. What are your peers and you thinking about, the decisions that are being made in Florida, the education folks with the curricula, and what could be told and taught in terms of the true story of the history of this nation and how it was founded? What's the tone and tenor there, and how do you keep going?
Well, it's again, thank you for that question. And it is very mixed. There are many of us that really, professionals in the DEI work that are really sad about what is happening in our country, because it makes our work a lot more difficult. But more than making the work difficult, it's moving in a direction of limiting the education of the truth of our history, for one, but also it leads to more limited access, again, to higher education. The affirmative action decision of the Supreme Court is, we haven't seen it yet, but we are going to see an impact on that, right? And it's very, very sad. So what we're doing is we're trying to find other ways to continue to do that work in ways that are significant, to continue to provide access to education through our institutions. We, of course, need to follow the law, but there are alternative ways to provide that access. And many of us are talking to each other, sharing those ideas and those resources, supporting each other, and talking to our presidents and our vice presidents of enrollment with alternatives and ideas of how to continue to do this work. So that's one of the things. And the other thing is, like I mentioned, we continue to work even harder. Rather than give up or feel frustrated, we need to support each other, and we are in connection with each other all the time to know how to do this. And the other piece of this is that, for a number of years, there's been the sense that anybody who is from an underrepresented, specifically in terms of race or ethnicity, identity, can do this work, one, or should do this work just because of their identity. And that's not true, right? And that's part of the work that we're trying to do. You can have that identity, but you also need to have the professional training and expertise on how to do this work. So one of the things that we're trying to do as practitioners in this field is, how do we encourage young people like all of you on this call to think about that work as a profession? How do I get engaged? What do I do in college? What do I do for a master's or a graduate program? What kind of internships do I need to be engaged in to really learn the professional skills and the knowledge to do this work in the best way possible? Just because you have the identity is not enough. We need the professional training, and we as DEI practitioners are trying to encourage young people to get into this field and get the knowledge and the skills to continue this work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Richie, you had your hands raised?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. Dr. Hernandez, Jarvis, I'm curious about the role of collaboration with your guys' DEI program. You see, at my school, we have a DEI program that's a couple years old. And what I've observed is it's its own entity. And I think that they struggle to get engagement within that program. And I've also observed that where there's collaboration, there's growth. And how does the college implement that type of collaboration across the board? And I'm talking about among the professors, among the classrooms, and not just as its own program in and of itself. How can it be implemented strategically throughout the campus? Does your school do that? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Excellent question, Richie. That's not an uncommon problem in the nation. There's a lot of universities that struggle with that. Let me say this, at Puget Sound, I'm actually the inaugural vice president. I've been here for a little over 2 years. And that was a institutional desire precisely to address what you were saying, that in the past that work had been pretty siloed to an office or to a particular group. And they felt this needs to be brought to the higher levels, to be institutional, and send the message to the entire university that that's what we're doing. So the university, the board, and the president opened this position as a vice president level, which means that I'm part of the cabinet and I connect directly with other vice presidents. And that has allowed us to do a lot of very close collaboration. So an example, I really work with the vice president for student affairs, and her team and my team are designing things like our orientation program has been really shifting to look at a lot of issues of identity development and sense of belonging, and including this DI work. So we collaborate a lot, but also connecting with the provost and with the deans. So we're doing a lot of work with the faculty. And again, it's not perfect. There's always going to be pockets of resistance to this work. That's always going to happen. But if it's happening and the message is that this is an institutional priority and that the work is not supposed to be just the Office of Institutional Equity, right? That the work is done by the entire campus community. And that's the message that we keep saying. No, we all need to do this. I personally speak to every month, any new employee at the university during their new employee orientation, I come in and talk to them. I said, this is an expectation of you as a new employee to be thinking about these issues in this way, right? So there's a variety of ways in which you can do, and the collaborations do happen. Sometimes it's challenging to get them there, but we are moving, more and more in that direction. And, Ryan and others can probably, Ryan is a Puget Sound, can share too some of the things that are happening in terms of collaboration that are just really, really, inspiring. But there's others that are challenging. I'm not going to tell you it's all perfect and beautiful. We are working on that, but you're absolutely right. Collaboration, DI work is critical for its success.
Dr. Lorna, always a pleasure to see you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for being a friend of WASEN and the students across the state of Washington and across 3 different sectors. We value your work and that of your other practitioners and back you 100%.